The quiet ones are the most dangerous. Seattle General's emergency department hummed with its usual chaos at 6 in the morning, phones ringing, monitors beeping in overlapping rhythms, the smell of antiseptic and coffee mixing into something that never quite left your clothes. Katie Morrison had been breathing it for 7 years, and she'd learned to move through the noise like water through a sieve, present but unnoticed. Her scrubs were always pressed. Her blonde hair sat in a regulation bun so tight it pulled the skin at her temples. The slight limp favoring her left leg made most of the staff assume car accident, custody battle, some suburban tragedy. Nobody asked. Katie preferred it that way. She restocked Trauma Bay 3 with a kind of methodical precision that came from having done the same thing 10,000 times before. For catheters arranged by gauge. Airway equipment organized by size. The fluorescent lights overhead hummed at a frequency that most people learned to unhear after a week. Katie never unhired it. She heard everything. The cardiac monitor in Bay 1 showing sinus rhythm at 84 beats per minute. The ventilator in the ICU step-down unit wheezed its mechanical rhythm somewhere down the corridor. Footsteps, Dr. Caldwell's Italian loafers on the tile floor, that particular squeak of sole against wax that meant he was moving with purpose. She didn't look up from the supply cart. In her locker, folded against the metal inside lining of her jacket, was a patch. Faded. Barely held together by thread that had gone grey over time. The 75th Ranger Regiment crest. She'd cut it from her dress uniform the day her medical discharge papers became official, the day she stopped being Major Katie Morrison and became just Katie, the quiet nurse who nobody could quite remember hiring. Some days she didn't think about what the patch meant. Most days she didn't. But at 6 in the morning, when the hospital was still moving slower than it would by noon, she thought about it sometimes while her hands moved through their routines, muscle memory from a life she'd deliberately buried. The left leg, the one that drew assumptions about car accidents, carried shrapnel from an IED that had detonated 20 meters from her position in Sanjin Valley, Helmand Province. The surgeons had pulled out the pieces that didn't belong and left in the pieces too close to nerve endings to risk extracting. The limp was permanent. Minor. The kind of thing that made people look away because they weren't sure if they were supposed to see it. Dr. Caldwell was looking. He stood at the physician's station with his arms crossed, watching her with the intensity of a man cataloging weakness. Chief of Emergency Medicine for the past 6 years. Board certified. Married to someone on the hospital foundation board. A golf friend of the hospital administrator. He'd built his authority the way powerful men usually did, not through competence, though he had that, but through the careful construction of a network that would catch him if he fell. He'd never met a person he couldn't control through a combination of charm, threat, and strategic information. He'd never met someone who'd already lost everything. Katie finished restocking and pushed the cart into the hallway just as the first patient rolled through the double doors. 83-year-old with chest pain and a nitroglycerine prescription. Routine. She moved to meet the paramedics, her movements economical, speaking in the low measured tone that made people lean in instead of asking her to repeat herself. The patient's daughter reached out and grabbed Katie's arm. Will she be okay? Katie didn't glance at her, just kept her voice level. Let's get her into the bay first. Then I'll know more. It was the kind of thing nurses said 1,000 times a day. It was also the truth. By 7:30, they had a motor vehicle accident with lacerations requiring more than basic sutures. By 8, a child with an asthma exacerbation who turned dusky before his mother had realized how bad it was getting. Katie moved between the bays with the kind of invisible competence that made the chaos look organized. She established for access on the first attempt on every patient, a skill that came from having done it in combat conditions where there was no second attempt, no do-over, no mercy if you missed. Her hands never trembled. Not now. Not when the blood pressure dropped. Not when the monitor showed a rhythm that required immediate intervention. At 8:45, Dr. Caldwell watched her manage a gunshot wound to the left shoulder. The patient rolled in with a blood pressure of 132/87, already stabilizing from pre-hospital fluid resuscitation, but the wound needed assessment, sutures, probably orthopedic consult for the bullet trajectory through bone. Katie moved to the bedside before the attending even approached, her hands already reaching for a 14-gauge angiocath needle, already knowing what she needed to see. The patient's arm was slick with blood, but her hands didn't shake as she prepped the antecubital fossa and placed the line on the first stick, watching the vein flash as blood rushed backward into the chamber. The attending nodded at her. "Good work, Morrison." Standard praise. The kind anyone would give. But Caldwell saw something else. He saw hands that moved with a precision that didn't belong in a civilian ER. He saw a woman who'd assessed the wound and decided on the vein location before the patient even hit the stretcher. He saw someone whose muscle memory operated several steps ahead of her voice, and whose voice never rose above a whisper even when the situation demanded volume. He saw weakness pretending to be competence. After the patient was stable and the attending had moved on to the next bay, Caldwell stepped beside her at the charting station. He pitched his voice low enough that the nearby staff would have to strain to hear, which meant they would all listen intently. "Nurse Morrison." His voice carried the particular cadence of a man who'd learned that volume wasn't necessary when you had institutional authority. "When you're done here, come see me in my office." It wasn't a question. Katie's hands paused in the electronic medical record for exactly half a second, then resumed typing. Her jaw pressed in slightly, a movement so minute that only someone trained to read faces under stress would notice. She didn't look at him. She didn't say yes, sir, or apologize or ask what this was about. She just nodded, a single movement that communicated nothing but compliance, and continued documenting the procedure she'd just completed. Needle gauge. Insertion site. Patient tolerance. The clinical facts that would protect her when, not if, when, this became more than a management observation. The thing Caldwell didn't understand about the quiet people was that silence wasn't weakness. It was bandwidth. It was the ability to think while others were talking. Katie Morrison had learned silence in a country where noise meant exposure, where the person who talked first usually died first, where the value of a human being was measured in what she could do when everything was falling apart. She finished her documentation, clocked off at 11:15 after her 8-hour shift, and walked past the security desk with her badge clipped to her belt and her jacket draped over her arm. The patrol unit patch was still there, folded into the lining, close enough to her heart that she could sometimes feel it through the fabric if she was thinking about it. She tried not to think about it. Most days, most hours, most minutes, she succeeded. The parking lot was cold under the autumn sky, and rain had started to threaten somewhere around 10 o'clock. She could smell it coming, that particular metallic scent that appeared 15 minutes before precipitation. Her boots were military issue, broken in years ago, sole worn in the pattern of someone who'd walked through countries without names while carrying weight most people would collapse under. She'd replaced them twice since then. These boots were just boots now. Civilian issue. The kind anyone could buy. What they couldn't buy was the thing living in her chest that never quite settled, that woke her at 3 in the morning thinking about Helmand Province and the faces of 17 people she dragged out of a fire zone on a Tuesday in June. One of them was unconscious. One of them had a court-martial waiting in his future for a decision he'd made that would end her career, that would sever her from the only identity she'd ever held. One of them was the man now scheduled to arrive at Seattle General on a gurney in the next 48 hours, and Katie Morrison had no idea he was coming. The overhead PA crackled at 7:43 a.m. during morning rounds, and the entire third floor went still. Nurse Kitticat to Trauma Bay 3. Nurse Kitticat, Trauma Bay 3. Silence held for exactly 2 seconds. Then laughter, barely suppressed, but laughter nonetheless. An intern snickered into his clipboard. 2 nurses exchanged glances that said everything. Katie Morrison didn't flinch. She took one measured breath, the kind she'd taken before breaching a door in Sanjin Valley with a 12-man fire team, and walked toward Trauma Bay 3, where Drive Caldwell stood waiting with a clipboard and a smile that looked like a wolf showing teeth. Response time, 43 seconds, he said, not looking up from his notes. Unacceptable. Log it in her file, please. He turned to the charge nurse beside him, speaking as though Katie weren't standing 3 feet away. The patient in the bay was stable. She'd already assessed him in transit. Katie met Caldwell's eyes and said only, "What's the patient status, doctor?" Her voice was level, calm, the kind of calm that comes from having already survived worse. He dismissed her with a wave, already moving to the next patient, the nickname spreading through the hospital grapevine like contagion. By noon, even the surgical techs knew. Nurse Kitty Cat. The embarrassment had texture, she could feel it coating her skin like antiseptic, clinical and cold. But that wasn't the worst part. For days later, Katie was restocking the supply closet on the second floor when the door opened behind her and closed again. She heard the lock click before she turned around. Dr. Caldwell stood between her and the exit, not touching her, but close enough that she could smell his cologne, something expensive, something that smelled like privilege. Close enough that the confined space made the walls feel narrower than they actually were. The metal shelving pressed into her spine as he stepped forward, holding a folder inches from her face. "Your performance metrics are below standard," he said softly, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "I'm recommending a formal performance improvement plan. 30 days to demonstrate measurable improvement. One more incident, one more complaint, and you're terminated." He let the folder drop, let it brush against her chest. "Do you understand me, Morrison?" Katie's breathing stayed even, 4 counts in, 4 counts out, the same rhythm she'd used to control pain when shrapnel had embedded itself in her left shoulder in 2019, when she'd kept her hand steady enough to apply a tourniquet to her own arm before the medic reached her. Her jaw clenched once. Just once. She met his eyes without flinching, and something flickered across his face, frustration, maybe, that she wasn't breaking, that the fear he was trying to manufacture wasn't materializing in her pupils or her hands or her voice. A single tear escaped down her left cheek. Just one. She wiped it with the back of her hand without breaking eye contact and said, "I understand, doctor." Her voice didn't crack. Didn't waver. Didn't give him the satisfaction. He lingered 2 seconds longer, breathing the same recycled air, waiting for something, an apology, a plea, some crack in the facade. When it didn't come, he straightened his jacket, unlocked the door, and left. Katie stayed in the closet for 60 seconds, forehead against the cool metal shelving, shoulders rising and falling in steady measured breaths. Then she returned to work. The third strike came in the parking lot at 6:08 p.m. at shift change. The morning crew was arriving, 12 staff members in fresh scrubs, coffee cups in hand, heading toward the entrance, when Dr. Caldwell's voice cut across the asphalt like a scalpel. "Morrison!" Everyone stopped. 12 heads turned. 12 sets of eyes locked onto her car. Effective immediately, you're being reassigned from lead triage to float pool. Your inability to follow protocol is creating patient safety risks. He delivered it loud enough for the arriving shift to hear every syllable, loud enough that the words seemed to bounce off the parked cars. Float pool. The assignment for nurses who couldn't hack it, who were constantly rotated between units, who belonged nowhere because they belonged to everywhere. No home, no respect, no chance to prove themselves. One of the newer nurses whispered something. Another laughed. Katie stood beside her Subaru, hand frozen on the door handle, feeling the weight of 12 stares like pressure. Her face was stone, nothing moved, nothing changed. She took one breath. One single breath. Nodded once, a movement so small it was almost invisible. "I'll report to staffing at 0600, doctor." Caldwell smiled, satisfied finally, and turned back toward the hospital entrance. "See that you do, kitty cat." Katie got in her car. Closed the door. Sat in the driver's seat in complete silence for 10 minutes before her hands were steady enough to grip the steering wheel. The clock on the dash read 6:49 p.m. Outside the windshield, the Portland skyline was starting to blur as evening fell. She could see the Seattle General sign from the parking lot, illuminated against the darkening sky, could see the ER lights flickering on one by one as night shift preparations began. She'd worked night shift for the last 3 days, floating between units, belonging nowhere, dismissed by attendings who didn't know her name, pitted by nurses who recognized the float pool assignment as a quiet way to push someone out. And then, at 2:48 a.m. exactly, everything changed. The earthquake hit like the world was splitting open. Katie was in the overflow unit in the West Wing when the building started moving, not swaying, not settling, but moving like something alive, like the earth had decided to shake off all the structures humans had built on top of it. 43 seconds. That's all a 7.2 magnitude quake lasts, but 43 seconds is long enough for the lights to die. Long enough for the ceiling tiles to crash down. Long enough for a ventilator to stop breathing for the patient depending on it. Katie was on her feet before the shaking stopped. Her pen light was already in her hand, she kept it in her pocket like some nurses kept their phone, always there, and she moved through the darkness with muscle memory that had nothing to do with nursing school. The muscle memory came from something older, something buried, something she'd spent 5 years trying to forget. Her body knew this kind of chaos. Her hands knew what to do. The first patient was post-op, a woman with a fresh chest tube and a ventilator that had just stopped working. Katie found her in the dark, found her by the sound of panicked breathing, and started handbagging her, squeezing the ambu bag in steady controlled pulses. 40 compressions per minute of oxygen. The woman's oxygen saturation was probably dropping fast. Katie couldn't see the monitor anymore, but her hands knew the rhythm. Around her, the unit was disintegrating. A doctor was shouting contradictory orders. A nurse was sobbing in the corner, trapped between fallen ceiling tiles and a patient bed. Another nurse stood frozen, hands shaking, staring at a monitor that had gone dark. The backup generators hadn't kicked in yet. No lights. No power. No equipment. Just the darkness and the sound of people breaking. Katie's voice cut through it like it was coming from somewhere else, somewhere deeper. Dr. Hayes, secure the airway on bed 6. Dr. Patel, I need manual compressions on the patient in 8. Everyone else, find flashlights. Start handbagging the ventilator patients. ICU transfers first. It wasn't a request. It was a command. For a moment, no one moved. She was just a float pool nurse, just a woman they'd been dismissing for the last 4 days, but something in her voice made them obey. Maybe it was the certainty. Maybe it was the absolute absence of doubt. Maybe it was the fact that she was the only person in that room who actually knew what to do. By the time the backup generators kicked in at 3:04 a.m., Katie had organized the surviving staff into 2 teams, prioritized the 16 patients in the West Wing overflow unit by acuity, and was currently intubating a crash victim, a man with blunt chest trauma and a GCS score of 6, by feel alone. Her hands moved on their own, muscle memory taking over, the endotracheal tube sliding into place on the first attempt because her fingers had done this before, had done this in a field hospital in Helmand Province with mortar fire in the distance and the knowledge that if she missed, 17 people would die. A doctor stood beside her, watching. She could feel his eyes on her face, on her hands, on the absolute steadiness with which she was working. His name was Dr. Patel. She'd never spoken to him before. He looked at her the way people look at things they don't understand, the way people look at something dangerous that they've suddenly realized was standing next to them the whole time. Dr. Caldwell arrived at 3:18 a.m. His hair was disheveled. His eyes were wild. He took in the scene, the organized teams, the patients receiving proper care, the sense of authority that had somehow materialized in the wreckage, and his jaw went hard. Katie was in trauma bay 2, securing and fall line on another patient, when she saw him pull out his phone and step into the hallway. He made the first call at 3:22 a.m. The second at 3:34. The third at 3:51. Each time his voice got quieter, more controlled, but Katie could hear the anger underneath it, the fury of someone watching his power slip away in real time. By the time Katie emerged from the unit at 6:04 a.m., covered in dust and someone else's blood, having orchestrated the care of 11 post-earthquake patients with 0 equipment failure and 0 mortality, the day shift charge nurse was waiting for her with new orders. You're reassigned to the main ER for the rest of the week, the charge nurse said, handing her a printed schedule. Dr. Caldwell's directive. It was a lateral move that technically kept her employed. But it was also a deliberate erasure of the authority she'd just demonstrated. A removal from the unit she'd saved. A message delivered in the form of a schedule change. Katie took the paper without comment. She headed to the locker room, peeled off her scrubs, and pulled out her jacket from the bottom of her locker. Inside the lining, sewn so carefully that no one could see it unless they were looking, was a faded unit patch, 75th Ranger Regiment, so worn that the edges were starting to fray. She touched it just once, her fingers brushing the faded emblem, before changing into clean clothes. She was halfway through her shift in the main ER when an intern approached her at the supply station. "Hey, are you the nurse who organized the West Wing during the quake?" the intern asked. Katie didn't look up from organizing the crash carts. "My attending said you probably saved a dozen lives." Katie's hands didn't pause. "I did my job," she said quietly, which wasn't an answer at all. But that wasn't the worst part, either. And then, exactly 48 hours later, the ambulance bay doors opened, and everything Katie had spent 5 years rebuilding came crashing back down. The earthquake hit at 2:02 a.m. 7.2 magnitude. The West Wing collapsed like a house of cards, concrete and rebar punching through the ER's north wall, severing the power lines that fed the ventilators in the ICU. For exactly 4 seconds, the entire hospital held its breath. Then the emergency generators kicked in with a metallic shriek, and the backup lights flickered to life, casting everything in a sickly amber that made the chaos look like a war zone. Because that's what it was now. A war zone. The ambulance bay doors started opening at 2:51 a.m. One after another. The first wave came with broken legs and punctured lungs, with people who'd been sleeping in the West Wing when the building decided it was done holding them up. By 3:15 a.m., Seattle General had received 42 trauma patients. By dawn, it was 98. The ER wasn't equipped for this. No hospital in Portland was equipped for this. Dr. Caldwell stood in the command center, what used to be the break room, shouting orders that contradicted each other. "Trauma Bay 1, get me a thoracic surgeon." "No, hold ICU beds for the critical transfers." "I need someone in ortho now." His voice rose and fell like a siren, and every resident and nurse in earshot froze, trying to decode which orders actually made sense. None of them did. The power to the main pharmacy was intermittent. 2 of the 3 surgical suites had damage to the ceiling. The lab was running on a skeleton crew because half the techs lived in the west part of the city and couldn't get through the collapse zone. Katie pushed through the ER doors at 3:08 a.m. She'd been in her apartment, 17 blocks away, when the quake hit. She felt the walls move like the building was breathing, felt the ground roll beneath her feet in a way that liquefied her stomach. Her first thought wasn't about the hospital. Her first thought was Helm and Province. RPG fire. Incoming. The sensation was so identical, that particular flavor of the earth trying to kill you, that for 30 seconds she couldn't move. Then her phone buzzed. The hospital was calling. "All staff report immediately." Code disaster. Code triage. Code everything. She moved on muscle memory. Combat boots already laced. Scrub top over a sports bra. Car keys. Badge. The drive took 11 minutes because the main roads were cracked and impassable, forcing her down residential streets that looked like the war had come home. Tree snapped clean. A car crushed under a fallen storefront. Windows blown out like blind eyes staring. She drove through it without emotion, just another set of obstacles between her and the objective. The main power cut out at 3:44 a.m. Right in the middle of the third wave of arrivals. The lights died. The ventilators went silent. For exactly 2 seconds, the ER was completely dark except for the penlight over the reception desk, and every single person in that room stopped breathing. Then someone screamed. A patient, probably. Or a family member. Then the backup power kicked in, the generators clawing the hospital back to life, and the ventilators wheezed their mechanical rhythm again like sick animals waking up. But the main trauma bays had lost their overhead lights. The surgical team could work by the fixed ceiling lights, but the triage area, Katie's area, was lit by whatever penlight someone was holding and whatever ambient glow leaked in from the hallway. It was exactly like Kandahar. The forward operating base with half its power grid down. Casualties everywhere. Doctors shouting. Nurses running between patients like ants whose colony was under attack. The air thick with antiseptic and copper and the particular smell of disaster, ozone from the power surge, concrete dust from the collapse building, sweat from people operating on 20 seconds of sleep and pure adrenaline. Katie walked into Triage Bay 1 and she stopped being Katie Morrison, quiet nurse, nearly invisible, taking up as little space as possible. The change wasn't gradual. It was like flipping a switch. Her spine straightened. Her chin lifted. Her penlight moved across the incoming patients with mechanical precision, not kindness, not compassion, just assessment. Systolic BP? Breathing status? Alert or altered? Bleeding controlled? The questions fired like rounds from a rifle. She looked at a woman with a crushed pelvis and an open femur fracture and said, Trauma 2, type and cross 6 units, call it into OR. No please. No apology. Just the truth delivered like a weapon. A resident froze next to her, clipboard shaking. Katie grabbed it from his hands. You're wasting oxygen standing around looking scared. Go to Bay 3. Insert an 18 gauge in both arms. Now. He moved. They all moved when she spoke like that. Because when you've been to war, when you've stood in a field hospital where the alternative to speed was watching someone bleed out while you calculated which patient to save first, a collapse building in Portland doesn't register as outside your scope. It registers as a familiar problem requiring familiar solutions. The patients kept coming. 73 years old, subdural hematoma. 42, crush injury to the left leg. 6 years old, abdominal trauma, mother holding pressure on the wound with a piece of her own dress. Katie triaged with a penlight, moving through the chaos like water flowing around rocks. Her hands moved with the confidence of someone who'd done this before. Because she had. Countless times. In a dust storm outside Helmand Province with nothing but a headlamp and a trauma bag. At 5:32 a.m., the power stabilized. The main lights flickered back on. The ventilators in the ICU were running again. But the damage was done, patients had decompensated in the dark, oxygen saturation dropping, nurses improvising bagging techniques with ambu bags that were designed for short-term use, not 30-minute gaps in mechanical ventilation. Katie had already been planning for this. She'd sent 2 nurses to gather every backup ventilator in the hospital, the transport models, the PEDS units, anything that could be cannibalized to keep breathing going. When the lights came back, they had equipment positioned in 6 of the 7 affected ICU beds. She was in Trauma Bay 4, managing an arterial bleed on a man with a penetrating chest wound, when she heard the ambulance radio call. ETA 2 minutes. 42-year-old male, crush injury, tension pneumothorax, decreased breath sounds on the left, BP systolic in the 60s. The attending was tied up in ortho. The resident was in surgery. That meant it was her or the fresh out of med school intern whose hands were shaking so badly she couldn't place and for. Katie finished applying a pressure dressing to the arterial wound, cotton gauze with direct compression, her fingers working with surgical precision, and said to the trauma tech, call up to OR. Tell them I'm sending them a chest tube. Room 3 as soon as the current surgical case clears. The ambulance bay doors opened. The paramedics wheeled the incoming, male, 40s, face grey with pain, his entire left side crushed under what the paramedics said was a steel beam. 8 inches of structural steel that had pinned him against a concrete wall for 40 minutes until the fire department extricated him. Katie looked at him for exactly 1 second. Then she looked away. She didn't let her body go still. She didn't let her breathing change. But for 1 second, 1 single second, the world tilted. Helmand Province. 3 years ago. A sterile room with fluorescent lights and a man in dress blues sitting across from her, his face absolutely impassive as he read the charges. Court-martial. Breach of protocol. Abandoning her chain of command. Lieutenant Commander James Hartley. Bay 4. Now, Katie said, and her voice didn't shake because she'd learned not to let it. She'd learned that emotions were information, like pain was information, like blood pressure was information. You processed them and moved forward or you died. There was no third option. They wheeled Hartley into Bay 4. His chest barely rising. His oxygen saturation dropping. His heart rate spiking into the 140s. Tension pneumothorax, air trapped in the pleural space, collapsing his lung, compressing his heart. He had maybe 4 minutes before he coded out entirely. Katie moved to the bedside. She grabbed the chest tube kit from the crash cart. Number 28 catheter. She'd need to go between his ribs, find the second intercostal space, midclavicular line, decompress the pressure that was crushing his heart. O2 saturation dropping, the intern said. 88, 84. Katie didn't respond. She was already prepping his skin iodine solution that she applied with movements that looked like a surgeon's muscle memory, because they were. 3 tours in Helm and Province. 73 combat casualties she'd triaged and treated in forward operating bases where the power went out and the supply line got cut and you made do with what was in your aid bag. One of those techniques was how to insert a chest tube in the dark using a penlight held between your teeth and your own experience as your only guide. This was nothing. This was a warm hospital bed. This was overhead lights and proper equipment and a trained trauma team standing by. She found the space between his ribs. She felt the subtle resistance as the needle slid through the pleura. And then, the hiss. The sound of air escaping, pressure releasing, the sound of someone not dying anymore. Hartley's chest expanded. His oxygen saturation stopped dropping. 84, 86. 88. Katie withdrew the needle and secured the catheter with practiced precision, tape, bandage, securing the line so it wouldn't migrate. She didn't look at his face. She didn't let herself think about Helm and Province or court-martial or the man who'd sat across from her in dress blues and read the words that ended her career. She just worked. Sinus rhythm, the cardiac monitor announced. Heart rate dropping. BP stabilizing. Good work, the intern said, and there was something like awe in his voice. Katie didn't acknowledge it. She was already documenting the procedure, marking the time, 5:37 a.m., and the vital signs trending upward. O2 sat 94%. BP holding at 98 systolic. The immediate crisis passed. That's when she noticed Dr. Caldwell standing in the doorway. He was watching her. Not the patient. Her. And his expression was something she'd never seen before on his face. It wasn't anger. It was something more dangerous than anger. It was calculation. He stepped inside the bay. Problem, Nurse Morrison. His voice was soft. Conversational. The voice of a man who'd just watched his carefully constructed hierarchy collapse and was already calculating how to rebuild it. Katie didn't look up from her charting. No, doctor. You froze when you saw the patient. He said it quietly. Matter of fact. A statement of fact that was a complete lie. I saw you hesitate. That hesitation cost us 40 seconds. Katie's jaw tightened. Just slightly. A muscle flex that took half a second and controlled her entire body. The patient stable now, doctor. Did I stutter, Nurse Morrison? I said you froze. That's going in your file. Failure to maintain composure during crisis. Delay in treatment due to emotional distress. He smiled then, and it was the smile of a man who'd found a new weapon. I think we'll need to revisit your fitness for duty after this shift. He turned and walked away before she could respond. Not that she would have. Katie had learned years ago that responding to accusations like that only made them louder. You absorbed them the way a sandbag absorbs rounds. You didn't fight back. You just stood there and let the impacts happen and waited until they were finished shooting. But as she finished securing the chest tube and stepped away from Hartley's bedside, she felt something shift inside her. Something that had been locked down for 5 years. Something that remembered what it felt like to have authority. To have earned it. To have people jump when you gave an order because they trusted you. That something stirred, and for the first time since the earthquake hit, Katie felt afraid. Not of Caldwell. Of what might happen if she stopped pretending to be small. The 36 hours after the earthquake became a blur of decisions that left no room for thought. Katie moved through Seattle General's ruined West Wing like a ghost inhabiting her own body, triaging survivors in the backup generator's amber light, fashioning tourniquets from bedsheet strips, talking a panicking resident through a needle decompression while the fluorescent lights flickered like a heartbeat refusing to stop. She didn't sleep. She didn't sit. Her scrubs were stained with iodine and someone else's blood, her hands moving with muscle memory so ingrained it felt like the hands belonged to someone else entirely, someone who'd trained for exactly this kind of chaos in a desert 12,000 miles away. By hour 24, the hospital had stabilized enough that the real work began, accounting for patients, checking the duty rosters, verifying who'd made it and who hadn't. That's when Katie noticed the first inconsistency. Her name wasn't on the triage log for Trauma Bay 3, though she'd worked there for 14 consecutive hours. She'd documented every patient, every intervention, every decision. The log now showed a different nurse's initials. She said nothing. Kept working. By hour 30, Dr. Caldwell had made his calls. She learned about it from the charge nurse, whispered in the medication room like a confession. Caldwell had spoken to 3 hospital board members, all men who golfed with him at Riverside Country Club, all of them grateful for the donation he'd made to their children's elite prep school scholarships. By dinner time, the reassignment notices went out. The nurses who'd worked alongside Katie, the ones who'd seen her command the trauma bays with supernatural calm, were suddenly transferred to other departments. Night shift. Pediatrics. Clerical roles. Not punishments on paper, just staffing adjustments during the crisis. But Katie understood the message. Isolate her. Strip away witnesses. Make her invisible again, but this time in a way that couldn't be challenged. The altered duty logs appeared on the hospital's internal system at hour 33. Katie discovered them by accident when she pulled up her own schedule for the next shift. The entries were clinical and damning. Nurse Morrison absent from post during critical hours. Failed to maintain unit communication. Prioritized personal activities during active emergency. Every sentence was a knife wrapped in bureaucratic language. The documentation was meticulous. Dr. Caldwell was nothing if not thorough. He'd altered entries in a way that would require hospital IT to trace back to the source, and even then, it would look like a clerical error, a tired nurse making mistakes during a crisis. Her word against his. Except his word was written in the system, official, dated, signed by the chief of emergency medicine himself. That mattered in ways that testimony didn't. At hour 36, Katie swiped her access badge to enter the ICU and nothing happened. The light turned red. The magnetic lock didn't click open. She swiped again. Red again. A security guard appeared, not unkindly, but firm. Your access has been restricted pending administrative review, Ms. Morrison. You'll need to check with HR. She was still in her scrubs. Still had patients in bed she'd admitted. Still had a ventilator setting she needed to adjust on the SEAL patient in Bay 7. The guard wouldn't let her pass. Katie turned around and walked to the break room instead, sat on the plastic chair that nobody had cleaned in days, and stared at the blank television screen mounted on the wall. No anger. No tears. Just a strange, hollow absence of feeling, as if her nervous system had finally decided it was done processing information. Her phone buzzed 3 times. She didn't look at it. The termination notice came at hour 38, hand-delivered by an HR administrator who couldn't meet her eyes. The paper was heavy stock, official letterhead from Seattle General Hospital, printed in serif font that made it look like a court judgment. Effective immediately. Failure to maintain professional standards. Patient safety concerns. Medical board review pending. Signed by Dr. Robert Caldwell and 2 board members she'd never spoken to. The administrator left it on Katie's locker, said something about Katie's final check being processed, and disappeared. Katie held the letter without reading it twice. Once was enough. The words had already burned themselves into her brain. She sat in her car 48 hours after the earthquake, in the basement parking garage under Seattle General, with the termination letter on the passenger seat and her hands too numb to turn the key. The engine was dead. She was dead. The car smelled like stale coffee and the copper scent of blood that wouldn't wash out of her scrub jacket no matter how many times she'd run it through the hospital laundry. Above her, through the concrete ceiling, she could hear the muffled sounds of the hospital continuing without her. Monitors beeping. Nurses calling out orders. The rhythm of a place that had already moved on. Her head rested on the steering wheel. Rain had started outside, pattering against the windshield like fingers tapping for entry. She thought about the patch in her locker upstairs, the one piece of her old life she couldn't let go of, 75th Ranger Regiment, faded to almost grey, sewn inside the lining of her dress uniform jacket that hadn't seen daylight in 3 years. She wondered if she should have burned it years ago. Wonder if pretending to be small had been worth anything at all. Her phone buzzed. Then again. She didn't move. The knocking on her window came hard enough that she jerked upright, her heart slamming against her ribs like a trapped animal. The ER charge nurse stood in the rain outside her door, face urgent, soaked through. Katie rolled down the window. "Katie, you need to come. Now. It's the SEAL in ICU. He's awake and asking for you." Katie's hands were numb as she followed the nurse inside, past the security desk that should have stopped her but didn't, past the staff who didn't make eye contact, into the ICU where Hartley was sitting up in bed for the first time since the earthquake. His daughter, maybe 16, dark hair, navy brat bearing, stood beside him with her arms crossed over her chest. Hartley's eyes locked on Katie the moment she appeared in the doorway, and his voice was rough from the endotracheal tube but absolutely clear, Reaper 6. The intern in the corner looked up, confused. Katie froze. The call sign hung in the air like a live grenade, like something from another lifetime spoken in a place it had no right to exist. Katie's throat closed. Hartley's daughter's eyes widened. Reaper 6? Like a military thing. Katie couldn't speak. Hartley reached into the bag beside his bed, his personal effects, saved by the ER staff, and pulled out his jacket. From inside the lining, he extracted something faded and small, 75th Ranger Regiment. The same unit crest that Katie had in her locker, the same patch that had survived 3 years of her trying to bury it. "You kept it," Katie whispered. Hartley nodded, his face twisted with something that looked like pain, like remorse, like a man carrying weight that had finally become too heavy to hold alone. "I kept it because you saved 17 of my men, and I destroyed you for it. The court-martial was wrong. I was wrong. I came to Portland to find you, to tell you the review board overturned it, but then the earthquake, the ICU door slammed open." Dr. Caldwell stood there with 2 security guards flanking him like he'd commanded them into position, his face red, his breathing hard. "Nurse Morrison, you are terminated and trespassing. Officers, remove her." Katie didn't resist as the guards approached. She was too tired. Too empty. Her body had already surrendered long before her mind caught up. But Hartley's daughter stepped between them, her voice shaking but fierce. "She saved my dad's life. Twice. And you fired her." Caldwell's smile was thin and vicious. "Hospital policy is not your concern, young lady." Outside, through the ICU windows, the morning sun was rising over Portland in pale gold lines, and Katie could hear a sound she hadn't heard since Helm and Province, a sound that made her bones recognize something her mind couldn't yet comprehend. Rotors. The distant percussion of helicopter blades cutting through dawn air, growing louder, Closer, the acoustic signature of a Black Hawk's main rotor in that particular rhythm that meant business. The guards hesitated. Caldwell's face went from red to white in the span of a breath. That sound meant authority he couldn't argue with. That sound meant something was about to end. The sound reached the ER first, a deep percussion that made the fluorescent lights rattle in their fixtures like bones in a box. Rotors. Close. The nurses at the front desk looked up simultaneously, and that moment of collective confusion stretched thin as a sensor alarm wailed somewhere in the ICU above them. A Black Hawk helicopter didn't arrive at Seattle General at 0547 on a Tuesday morning without reason, and every person who'd worked in emergency medicine long enough to know the difference between a medevac and something else went very still. The rotors were still shaking dust from the parking garage when two figures moved through the automatic doors in synchronized precision, combat boots that left wet prints on the tile, tactical vests the color of spent ammunition casings, the kind of bearing that made the air pressure change. Navy SEALs didn't walk into civilian hospitals in full operational gear unless the world was ending or someone very important had something very specific they needed. The taller one, a team leader with a scar running from his left temple to his jaw like a lightning strike on granite, stepped directly to the triage desk and didn't ask a question. "Major Katie Morrison," he said. "Where is she?" The charge nurse blinked twice. In her 17 years at Seattle General, no one had ever arrived via helicopter looking for a float pool nurse by rank. She opened her mouth, closed it, and glanced toward the back hallway where Katie was finishing a shift note at one of the documentation stations, her posture curved slightly forward, hands steady as they'd been for every shift across every crisis, every moment of humiliation that Dr. Caldwell had engineered falling away like rain off treated fabric. The charge nurse pointed without speaking, because some situations transcended the need for words. Katie looked up exactly 2 seconds before Hartley appeared in the doorway, not on a gurney this time, but upright in a wheelchair, his right leg still bandaged beneath the cuff of civilian cargo pants, and in his hands, held like an artifact pulled from a tomb, was a patch. Faded past the color of any particular regulation, the edges worn soft from decades of hands touching it, the 75th Ranger Regiment crest she'd cut from her last uniform the morning she'd stopped being a soldier and started trying to be nobody at all. Hartley's eyes met hers across 20 feet of ER floor, and he held the patch up so the light caught the metallic threads. She didn't move. The room had gone so quiet you could hear the ventilators humming one floor up, that mechanical breath that sounds like hope when you're listening closely enough. Hartley's daughter, tall, 17, with her father's precise way of holding her shoulders, stepped out from behind his wheelchair and stared at Katie with the exact expression of someone watching the last piece of an impossible puzzle snap into place. "You're a major?" The girl's voice pitched upward, not quite a question, more like confirmation of something she'd been too young to understand until this exact moment. Katie didn't respond. She set down her pen, crossed her hands on the desk in front of her, and felt the silence accumulate like sediment. The SEAL team leader stepped forward, and when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of testimony, the kind of words that bend the shape of rooms simply by being released into them. Major Morrison was awarded 2 silver stars, pause, letting that sink, and a Purple Heart for evacuating 17 wounded from a hot landing zone in Helmand Province. The second pause was longer. The combat injury that ended her active career saved my entire platoon. Every single one of us who got home alive got home because she refused to leave people behind. He looked directly at Katie then. The Army spent 3 years claiming you failed a protocol. We spent 3 years knowing the truth. We came to make sure everyone else knows it too. An FBI agent stepped forward from the contingent that had arrived with the SEALs, and when he opened the folder in his hands, the pages caught the institutional light like evidence of a different kind of crime. Dr. Marcus Caldwell attempted to forge personnel records. The agent's voice was administrative, precise, the way federal investigators sound when they're describing crimes that carry federal time. Altered duty logs from the earthquake to document false abandonment of protocol. Fabricated performance evaluations with documented falsification. Attempted suppression of a decorated military officer's background to justify termination. He looked around the suddenly very crowded ER, made sure the morning news cameras, already positioned at the front doors because someone had tipped them off, because this was the kind of story that needed witnesses, could see what came next. He set the folder down and reached for the handcuffs at his belt with the kind of economy of motion that meant this was the easy part, the inevitable conclusion of a case that had already been solved. Dr. Caldwell emerged from his office at that exact moment, drawn by the commotion, and watched the color drain from his face like someone pulling a plug. The small man who had been the largest authority in this building found himself standing in the center of a room that had shifted its entire axis of power, and for the first time in his career, he was the smallest person present. The FBI agent read him his rights with the kind of professional courtesy reserved for situations where the verdict had never been in question. The handcuffs clicked with a sound like a medical instrument tray closing. Dr. Caldwell's lawyer, apparently already retained through some premonition of disaster, stepped forward and whispered something urgent, and Caldwell's head moved in small, precise denials as the agent led him toward the doors where morning news cameras waited like sharks that had smelled blood in the water. The image would be everywhere by noon, a man in a white coat being escorted from a hospital by federal agents, his face a portrait of the moment everything ends. The SEAL team leader watched him go, then turned back to Katie with a slight nod that contained entire conversations. "We have something for you," he said. From his pocket came an envelope, official, sealed with the kind of wax that hospitals didn't use anymore. "Walter Reed Medical Board review completed. Your discharge status is overturned. You're being reclassified as retired with full honors and back pay." He extended his hand. Katie stood and shook it, and his grip was the grip of a man apologizing with his entire body. "Welcome home, Major." But it was Hartley who held out the faded patch, and when Katie took it from his hands, the weight of it felt distributed across 3 years of searching for her, across missions that had gone differently because she wasn't there, across a reconciliation that had started the moment he'd recognized her standing at his bedside. "I can't undo what I did," Hartley said quietly, and Katie noticed his daughter was crying now, silently, watching her father speak truth the way combat soldiers learn to do. "But I'll spend the rest of my life trying." Katie stood there holding the patch to her chest, and 17 people in that ER watched her, the charge nurse, the residents, the techs, the security guard, the morning arrival staff who had just clocked into an entirely different world than the one they'd left the evening before. Her voice, when she spoke, had dropped an octave from the careful deference she'd cultivated across months of invisibility. "You came back for me. That's enough." She looked at Hartley's daughter. "You going to finish school?" The girl nodded, still crying. "I want to go to the Naval Academy. Like my dad says you should have." "Then go," Katie said. "Go and finish what everyone who doesn't know your story thinks is over." An administrator appeared at that moment with a folder of paperwork and a proposition. The hospital board, having watched a decorated military officer get arrested in their ER and a federal investigation unfold across 48 hours, had decided to hire the woman who had saved the building during an earthquake. Director of Emergency Preparedness, a brand new position created specifically because someone had finally recognized that the quietest person in the room was the one who actually knew how to hold it together. A salary that represented not just payment but restitution. A office. A team that answered to her. A second chance offered in the kind of language that meant it wasn't a second chance at all, it was a first real chance, finally, at being seen. Katie looked at the folder, at the seal standing in front of her, at the patch in her hands that had traveled through 3 wars and 2 continents before landing in her palm again. "Yes," she said. And this time, when she said it, her voice filled the room like a command, because Major Katie Morrison was finally, fully, home. The closing shot would be later, 6 months later, Katie walking through Seattle General in the crisp uniform of her new rank, the faded patch now framed on her office wall, Hartley's daughter's handwritten thank you note on her desk beside a photograph of the SEAL team at their homecoming. But this was the moment that mattered, the instant when the room understood who it had been standing next to all along, and the woman who had learned to be invisible finally learned to be seen. Behind them, the morning news cameras captured every frame. And somewhere in the building, in a security guard's uniform that fit all wrong, Dr. Marcus Caldwell's career ended not with a bang but with the sound of an elevator closing on a world that no longer had any use for him. The quietest person in the room might be holding it all together. That's what happened when Katie Morrison finally stood up straight. Thank you for watching. If this story hit different, please like, subscribe, and drop a comment. Tell us what you would have done if you were standing in that ER. What would you have said to Caldwell when the cameras were rolling? And if you know someone who's been underestimated by people who had no idea who they really were, share this with them. They need to know they're not alone. We'll be back next week with another story about the people the world overlooks, because those are always the ones who change everything.